Hi, I'm Dr. Diane Neubauer, and I'm here with,
Dr. Reed Riggs.
yeah, and we're talking about conversations about language teaching and learning today. I am a former K to 12 Mandarin Chinese language teacher, and for the past couple years after my PhD, I've been doing teacher education instruction at the university level, some ESL, some more world language methods, and some general education in different university settings.
And I am currently teaching 9th through 12th grade IB Mandarin. And Diane and I do research together. We look at play, we look at teaching practices, and we both have been involved in doing workshops for teachers, teacher education, at various conferences and local state workshops for about 10 years. So while I am teaching in a classroom right now, I use a lot of this experience to inform what I can bring from research into teaching. So my PhD was also focused in classroom practices and using that as kind of a laboratory to look at the input that students get and what's in the input, what's in the output. But more recently, I've shifted more focused to be more focused on social interaction, conversation analysis, things like that. So that's what we find useful to bring to teachers is to see why can we make this podcast? Why are we making this podcast? It's to see if we can build little bridges between research and what teachers and teacher educators might consider for
Yep.
classrooms.
And we like talking about, like Reed and I like talking about this stuff amongst ourselves. And so we decided, hey, what if we just started talking about this stuff sometimes and recorded it? And that's where this is.
That's what
So,
this is. So
yeah.
Dan, you're leading this episode. This is about your
Mhm.
experience most recently this semester mainly.
Yes. Yeah. So this was spurred on by, I was teaching an undergraduate course at the University of Iowa on the name of the course is actually, let's see, Language, Power, and Education, something like that. Teaching multilingual learners. Something I should look it up. But the focus of the course is on all aspects of teaching English language learners in a US classroom setting and issues of social justice, issues of linguistic development. I mean, we covered the whole gamut from language experienced in the mind, developed in the mind, to social interaction and why that matters, and how can we do a good job as teachers to really help these students be affirmed in who they are and gain English. And so a lot of it was very research based. And one of the things that it really highlighted to me was that my students, who I just thoroughly enjoyed working with. I thought they were great. They had some just gaps in what they expected research was, even in identifying what is research versus what is a theoretical piece or a survey of other research. Like, how can you recognize this is a new study and this is how they did it and this is what they found? They had difficulty even recognizing that kind of an item sometimes. And as I thought about it, this really didn't surprise me that much because I think I saw this in myself as a classroom teacher in K to 12 just a few years ago. And I learned things from being a PhD student, and it was very eye-opening. I just recently had a Facebook post memory, so a past year at the same date, it pops up again, and you can go, oh, I remember when that happened. So I had written a reflection about my first semester as a PhD student, and the thing that it was fun to read again because one of the things I wrote about was how I described it as my relationship to research has changed. Like I thought about it in a very different way. And so I wanted to bring some of the perspective that I've gained from that in here and talk about maybe some of the things that I saw with my students that I've heard with language teachers and that I know I have had myself about what is research, how does it relate to teaching, what do we get from it, why is it written the way that it is, why it's so academic language and
Yeah.
obscure and hard to read sometimes. Um, so I wanted to be able to bring some of those things together.
Yeah, and I think that you and I have talked about research for as long as we've known each other as professional teachers, but then also into our PhD programs. I started mine somewhat before yours, but we've
Yeah, I
always
think
been
you were
talking
like in your
about,
first or second year when I met you,
I think
maybe.
so. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And going to teacher conferences, we'd always hear teachers talking about, oh, the research says this, or here's this one research article. It's always been something that's on the radar of teachers to find useful. Impressionistically, it's often something that teachers will use to defend their current practices. They'll say, well, I do this. This research article shows that this is what I should be doing. Or if they know more research, or if they've heard people say there's more research, then they'll say that there's a lot of research supports this
Or
thing that
the
I'm doing.
research.
The research, yeah.
That phrase
Yeah.
gets used sometimes too.
So I think that these are super well-meaning. We all have a job to do, and we want to be good at teaching. A lot of us are in institutional contexts with institutional pressures to conform to how a department is teaching. We have colleagues that say you have to teach this one certain way. We all have to be on the same page in terms of our teaching practices, in terms of our goals. And it makes sense for teachers to say, I need something to defend what I'm doing. And research seems like the most authoritative way that I can do this. And we see how that maybe works sometimes and often doesn't work for various important reasons. So I think that what we talked about doing for today's discussion is to just make it more clear, help make it more clear from our perspective, and from from reading researchers talking about research, and from being in classes where we're trained in how to read research, how teachers might look at research a little differently, make use of it, and really importantly, when to not try to make use of it. I think these are some key areas to focus on.
Yeah. So shall I begin kind of with the basics? I think is where I was going to start with.
Sure.
So one of the things I mentioned, like that students had trouble even identifying, is this a research article? And I think what happens is there's a format. It looks academic-y. Like it looks like there's a title page, there's a fancy sounding chapter or article title, and the authors are there, and there's like the publishing information and all that. And I think that gives this veneer of that's research, but that of course is not necessarily research, because the same kinds of things could be a think piece. They could be a researcher, yes, someone drawing on various different research citations throughout the paper. But they may be more like advocating for a new idea or critiquing a problem area and advocating for what should teachers or researchers or both potentially be doing. And so knowing the difference between somebody who's thoughtfully working in this field for a long time, who's read a lot of research, who's probably had teaching experiences both at the direct level, teaching language learners, and as a teacher of graduate students or of undergraduate students who are reading and preparing to be teachers. Like if somebody like that is writing a piece, I think absolutely we want to carefully consider this person's well-informed opinion, but it is still a well-informed opinion if it's a think piece. So how can you tell? So are they referring to research but not talking about participants or the data that they used? And data doesn't just mean numbers. It could be through interviews, it could be through other words as data kinds of things. Observational data counts. Observing teachers in a classroom and seeing what they're doing, seeing and talking to someone out in the world who's learning a language in natural settings and observing what they do and then talking to them about it. All of those things could be data. So that if it's a research article, you're going to see something about this is the context in which we did this study. These are the participants in this study or the data that we use to analyze something. And they're going to talk about methods of what is it that they did carefully to investigate it. So it's a systematic way of investigating a question. And so different kinds of research address different kinds of questions. Some will be numbers based, so that's quantitative data, and some will be more like words and other kinds of like objects, I want to say, like images, video, pictures, potentially, classroom items like the sorts of worksheets that you give out, test pages that students see. Those could all be data as well. So you're going to see something about that there, and you're going to see that the researcher will tell you, this is how I analyzed it, and probably to some degree why they chose to analyze it that way and not another way.
Yeah.
They probably refer to other people who've done similar things, but that this is somehow a little different. They're not saying this is the end all and be all of answering this question for all time. It's saying, I've found this in this context, under these conditions, done this way. So I think my impression, and absolutely my students' impression, seems to be research is answering the question for all time, whatever question it was. Sometimes the researcher's question and the teacher who's trying to read the research article's question are very different, and they don't always recognize that. And
Right.
so the researcher is going to tell you what is the question or what is the area that they're investigating. And so we have to take that as is. They may not be directly applying what they're doing to a classroom setting, and they absolutely aren't aware of the teacher who's trying to read it and glean things that they can use in their classroom setting. So they don't know that teacher, and they don't know the teacher's context, and they can't necessarily speak directly to it. So the teacher has to be very informed, kind of having a research literacy and being able to both interpret, okay, this is what their goal was, this is what they were doing in that context, in this way, this systematic research method. And now they found this. Okay, what points do I think this might be helpful for me in the context that I have, which is different, almost doubtless it's different in some way or another. And so what kinds of aspects of it are useful to me? I sometimes have seen people really, the phrase that came to mind was they really poop on research, but they like the skepticism goes so high among some teachers that I think it's a frustration perhaps with the idea that that researcher is doing this thing over there and I don't care about that thing over there. I need to know what to do in my classroom. So that stuff's out. I don't care about it. In fact, I think that's too extreme. That's throwing out the whole thing. If we can understand what it is that research is trying to do and then what it can do for us if we're thinking about the language teaching context, we're going to get something and it's going to be helpful, but it's not going to be this blanket, this is it forever. The research
Yeah.
says done. You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
it's more like there's evidence for this. I'm keeping an open mind that I might need to tweak this again in the future, but I feel pretty good because I see that there's a lot of evidence for this.
Right.
XYZ thing I'm doing, or that I want to start doing because I see it, So that kind of went a little bit on a rabbit trail. Let me
Well,
come back to my students. Oh, yes, go
sure.
ahead.
Well, I just wanted to tack on to that.
Mhm.
I've had conversations with teachers over the years, especially when I was a PhD student, and different research studies were interesting to me, and I would share. So I'd say, it's really interesting, for example, that when people are processing chunks versus individualized words, that this study found that um, being exposed to chunks first for one group and then seeing the chunks then broken down seem to have a more helpful effect on learning compared to a group that saw the broken down forms first and then saw it chunked up afterwards. Um, and so, saying things like that, it's just so this research study was kind of interesting to me because the researcher was trying to understand what the brain is doing. It's very much a kind of a psychological question. How does the human brain process language? And so if we give it different kinds of stimuli, different kinds of inputs, and then just see what the brain does, then we can understand the brain better. And so to me, that was very interesting. But I would get responses from teachers who I'd share that with who would say, what, like, what does that tell me to do in my classroom then? Like, what is that researcher trying to say I should do in my classroom? And so then I would say something like, oh no, it's not a classroom study. It's just trying to understand how the brain works. And so I get that flabbergasted response from teachers who would say, oh, what are they doing? Isn't it our tax dollars funding this? Like, what shouldn't they, if they're not trying to help us in our classrooms, then what are they even doing? And I think that reveals a kind of preconception that any language related research is supposed to be helping classroom teachers. And even as I say this out loud, and I know that this recording will be watched by people, I think there will be people who will immediately respond, well, yeah, what else would it be? So I have a little some screenshots I took from a YouTube video that I think
Yeah.
is a nice. You want to read those off?
Yeah, yeah, go for it.
Okay. All right.
This is,
So
it
this is
seems a
from,
good place for it.
I think this is a good place for it, and the reason I'm sort of pilfering this from someone else is because it's a high quality video. It's on YouTube. It's from Mango Languages, and the video is called "What is Second Language Acquisition?" parentheses SLA, science behind, and then it cuts off for me. But I'm going to promote their video by reading some of their main points and just say that the fields are so big, and the video talks about this. These fields are so big and have branched out so much since the 1950s that any any video that's short is going to cut out a lot of it, but it's still getting at the main point. So here are a couple of screen grabs that I took.
And
Key
we'll share
questions.
the link, right?
We can
So
share the link. Yep. Mhm.
yeah,
So
we'll
key
have that
questions in
available.
SLA. Here's the theoretical side, and then there's a practical side. The theoretical side, this is what researchers often have been interested in. This is not all of it, but this is some indicators of how theoretical it is. Questions like this: does age affect language learning? Are some languages harder to learn than others? Why is it so hard to lose your foreign accent? How does speaking a second language affect your identity? How does the brain process second languages? How does learning a second language improve your tolerance for other cultures? Right? These all seem like things that we might ask in life, but then when we're planning a lesson in a classroom, we'd say, "Oh, it's too out there. It's not what I need right now." And just know that SLA researchers are digging around through all of these questions. The video then goes into these 5 areas of application that the research often intends to help. Education is just one of the 5. So what we're talking about now, teachers trying to teach, trying to enhance their lessons, make their lessons the best, make their curriculum the best for language proficiency to develop in our classrooms. Education is just one of the 5 application areas. Another one is public policy. You've got people immigrating to different countries and they have different language abilities, and immigration officers, customs agents, they need to know about the language abilities that they should expect from people coming through borders and then needing help and assistance getting settled into the country. It's not a classroom question. It's a different kind of application. These are real people with real needs. It just has nothing to do with teaching immediately. National security and diplomacy. And so part of this could be education-wise. We want to train diplomats and train spies and train government workers to do things, but also how much should we expect them to be able to do on a job at different proficiency levels? And so that's not just about teaching. It's about how should the job and workplace be arranged given different people's different proficiency levels. If you're at an ACTFL novice or a European CEFR B2, what does that mean for how the workplace should be adjusted to you, or what kinds of job tasks you should be given? The economy. And so in this video, they just said that there's a lot of need for people to speak a lot of different languages to be able to work and do things to just make money. So I'm not sure what else to say about that. And then the last one is cross-cultural understanding. And this one has come up in some of the AI groups that I've been looking at, that it might, if it is the case, I don't strongly believe that it is, but if it is the case that AI can replace all of our need for translation and work so that we just type in what we want in our language and it spits out a really good translation in the other language. If it's the case that that's true, that doesn't replace the ability to have a connection with a human in front of you. Nana and I, my wife and I just watched Leave the World Behind on Netflix last night.
Oh,
And there's a
great.
scene that I think every classroom should play. This woman speaking Spanish is frantic. She flags down Ethan Hawke's car and he stops for her and she can only speak Spanish and she's really scared. And he just says to her, "I'm sorry, I don't speak Spanish. I don't speak Spanish." And she's just terrified. And she's just, Nana and I were able to understand bits of it because our Spanish is, intermediate. Um, but he just gets more and more scared and he says, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry." And he rolls up his window and drives away.
Mm.
I think we all do that. I think we all do that. And I'm from California where we're surrounded by Spanish speakers. And if you're sitting at a seat in a restaurant and there's a lot of Spanish going on, a lot of English speakers will be like, it's too noisy, let's get up and leave. Like
Mhm.
that is just such an unconscious thing that we all often do. And being proficient in another language, I think, could help us do less of that and connect with other people more. But that's another area that researchers do look at. Researchers look at how does it affect your identity? How does it affect your social relationships? How does it affect your belonging, your sense of belonging in communities? So that's another area that researchers look at that it's nice for language teachers to know about. It doesn't directly tell us what and how to teach. Okay,
Yep.
so that's my little
Yeah.
aside.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful because it puts that very specific area of second language acquisition research and questions around that into perspective. So yeah, yeah. Um, let's see. I'll return to my class for this
Please.
semester because I started thinking about like, okay, so what do I really want to do for people who are brand new to thinking about research stuff? And one of the areas I anticipated was going to be like just give me some help on reading it. Okay, so now I've talked about like this is how you recognize whether or not this is research or if
Yeah.
it's just research informed scholarly opinion, advocacy, overview of other people's research. So those are all valuable pieces, but just if we're trying to read something that's an empirical study, it's kind of like going to the source directly rather than other people's writing about that source. So with the undergraduates I was teaching, one of the things I wanted them to be able to do was get a sense for like what what is this thing that I'm going to read? Who is it for? And then how might I glean something from it? So it was like kind of what you were saying already, Reed. I wanted them to be able to see it as it was for its own goals,
Yeah.
and appreciate that. Like before we read an actual empirical study in class, one of the things that I talked through with them was what can you expect this is written for people who are in a long, slow conversation across many different articles and many years of time. And they have particular jargon sometimes because they want to be very precise within their field. The critique would be, oh, that's academic-y sounding gatekeeping language that's going to try to drive other people out. And I don't, it could be, but it's also being able to be very precise by using specific terms from within this network of people working on these very specific questions. So know that if you're reading somebody's research article, it's not written directly for you as a language teacher or as an undergraduate student or graduate student even. We're leaning into somebody else's conversations and kind of looking over their shoulder like, okay, so that's what they're all talking about. Um, and
Yeah,
recognizing it for that.
it would be like looking over the shoulder of auto mechanics working on a car.
Mhm.
They need that precise language to refer to all the different specific things that they're working on. And to jump in and interrupt and say, "Oh, you're just trying to stop me from understanding how you repair cars." They weren't expecting you to be there. Like
Yes.
that's what
Yeah.
it is.
They're letting you look anyway,
Yeah. Yeah.
but it's not really for you. Yeah.
Right. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So helping them kind of get that expectation, like some things may be a little bit more difficult to see. But also one of the big things, and just in the sequence of what a research article is going to have, typically they'll begin with some sort of introductory section and then a literature review section. Sometimes they're labeled as such. What I saw, not so much this semester because I warned them about this, what I saw in a previous semester as a teaching assistant for the same course that I taught as an instructor this past semester, one of the things I saw students do is they would read that introduction and that literature review, which is looking at all the other kinds of research on the same kinds of topics. So they're giving an overview of this is the way that this has been done. These are the findings that these other people had. What they're doing there is contextualizing this is what my research question was, and this is why I did this thing this way. And
The
this is how
author, you
my
mean?
findings compare. Yes,
That's what
the
the
author.
author is doing.
The
Yeah.
author
Yeah.
means, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so when students are reading that first section, sometimes they are like, oh, that's facts. Like I would see them even sometimes use the term facts in writing about research. And it's like, maybe talk about evidence
The
instead.
findings. Yeah. So
Findings,
so and
yeah,
so found
evidence, yeah,
this. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that know that in that literature review, they may be just setting that all up in order to critique it in the next turn.
Yeah.
And so this doesn't mean I agree with all this. This is undisputed facts. This is what people have been talking about in this field. These are the kinds of ways that they've investigated it. These are the sorts of things that they've found. And so knowing like that opening section is going to be very helpful. And especially, I think if you don't know very much about the field, it's helpful because like, okay, so this is what the way the authors think about this. This is what they think is important for us as the reader to kind of set their study into a context and know where they're coming from. Okay. Either by contrast or by agreement, maybe some of both,
Yeah,
by what they write about there.
the tone in a literature review is often also meant to show good faith and good understanding. And
Yeah.
so they're not going to start out by saying, you know, these people found this and it's wrong, and these people found this and it's wrong, and these people found this and it's wrong. Usually they're trying to show this is the thinking of what has come before, and let me do my best faith, my best attempt, so that someone reading that who's into that view would say, yeah, that is what we think. Like, yes, you represented us well. And then after
Yeah.
that, the critique can come. It can say, here's what the gaps are, here's what's missing from it. So when you just look at that little part in the beginning, yeah, and you take it as like, oh, someone's telling me a story right now about what researchers have done before. Wow. Like you don't want to, you shouldn't take it on at face value. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. In fact, the specific thing that students had read in the previous iteration of the class that I was teaching, we didn't read this time, but what really highlighted this issue of you have to know what the literature review is trying to do. Um, I'm looking for the title on Google Scholar right now. It's by Blackledge and Crease, and I'll find the one. I think it's the one that was 2010 in the Modern Language Journal called Translanguaging in the Bilingual Classroom, a Pedagogy for Learning and Teaching, question mark. And in the lit review, what they were reviewing was that people have in research in 70s, 80s, 90s, early 2000s, pretty consistently said mixing languages is going to confuse the learner. And their findings were entirely different from that. So in their lit review, they were talking about how people were concerned about this, that this could be for various reasons. People thought that this was maybe hindering language development or confusing. And they found very differently that no, people who have multiple languages in their ability use them interchangeably, very flexibly and comfortably, and they don't get confused. And that was their finding. So when those students in that previous class back in 2020, when I taught as a TA, they read that lit review and thought, well, see, it's confusing to me. I'm a monolingual English speaker. When other people use multiple languages around me, I get confused. So it even resonated with their own experience. And in their reflection writing on this, it's like, whoa, oh no, we got to tell them how to read this article.
Yeah.
And so I was keen on it this time going into this course. I'll post that article though, because I think it's a great example of the thing I'm talking about, how easily you could do that if you don't know the way that research is written, and what the purpose of that opening section is. So after that kind of overview of what else has been done, then they're going to talk about their study, the methods of their study, who participated in it, where it was, the ages of people, the backgrounds of people linguistically, racially, ethnically, all kinds of different things there could be relevant. And so you know something about where it happened. This is helpful, I think, in drawing out possible implications for teaching because you can think about, do these folks sound anything like my students? For example, in that study I just mentioned, they were looking at young people in like weekend schools for Indian languages in the UK. So UK, English dominant society. These were kids growing up in the UK whose families had come from Pakistan and India and were preserving their languages through these weekend schools. And so they were kind of mid-teens and around those ages. But so you can think like, okay, they probably hear that language a lot at home. They probably are comfortably moving in and out of these two different languages. Is that the same as the kind of students that I teach? Maybe some, maybe not others. So you can kind of start thinking like, in what way maybe can I find some areas that this will be useful to me in interpreting my students and their responses and my classroom setting. So that's why it's helpful to see what they were doing. And then they'll talk about how they collected data, how they analyzed data, and then they'll list findings as a big section. Often the longest section of an article will be their findings.
Yeah.
And they'll talk about, what they think they saw, how they interpreted it. Even if it's got numbers as data, that doesn't make it objective. And if it's words as data, it doesn't make it inherently subjective, in my opinion. You're
Mhm.
going to have to evaluate all of it as a human endeavor that's fallible. And, we as the reader, likewise, right? We're
Yeah.
bringing in our own experiences and biases. We want to be carefully and thoughtfully looking at it, thinking of it as evidence, not as facts per se.
Yeah. I mean, what specifically happened, those are facts, but they're not
Yeah.
facts of life. They're
Yeah.
just facts of what happened that one time. Researchers typically want to then try to replicate that research by doing the same methods, similar population, see if they can find similar findings. Um, so, and that doesn't mean that the research then is nothing. I think of the progress of research a little like if you look back at the progress of TVs or cars, you could look back at, how cars looked when their first inventions over 100 years ago and say, oh, they keep changing it, so cars are nothing. It's like, no, they keep updating it. Um, the research is, we have the best we have, and then someone else will come along and do something else. But it's, I think another filter that it should kind of go through, asking teachers to just pluck out little bits from research might be asking a lot.
Yeah.
But it's also useful to work in groups and work in communities of other teachers who have been making things work for students. A big in K to 12 teaching, a big piece is engagement and just getting basic participation. It's not so given. So a lot of times, you'll have research participants who volunteered to be in the study, or you'll have research participants who are in a university classroom. There's always a much more mature and self-selected element to that, where the researcher says, here, let's try this activity, or let's try this task, and then let's see how it worked. And it's really hard to make those same kinds of things happen in a classroom where the students are younger. That's much harder to keep their attention. They want to know what the grade's going to be based on. They don't want to just try some new experiment. So yeah, it's really with a grain of salt. And so I think that also brings us to, not to cut you off, and we can continue
Oh, go for it.
what you're talking about, but also, when to not have such high expectations of research. I think there was a research article 20 or 30 or 40 years ago, I forgot. It was in the SLA literature, the second language acquisition, the research literature, called Great Expectations. And it was sort of, basically saying, we're doing science, we're trying to figure out how the brain works, we're trying to figure out how human societies work, we're doing research. And we were always asked, how does this relate to teaching? How can you help professionals in maybe teaching, maybe other professional settings too? And maybe you're asking too much of us. Maybe we can't. Maybe research shouldn't, we have our goals. We're trying to answer hard questions. But should we always be trying to help the professional world? And maybe not always,
I found the citation there. So Patsy Lightbound, 1985, Great Expectations, Second Language Acquisition Research and Classroom Teaching.
Oh, it's just classroom teaching. There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So she's right on our topic today.
Yeah, it's right on the topic of classroom teaching. And so I've also talked to teachers when I'm at a conference, for example, and I say, I want to go to these. And I've heard teachers say, colleagues of mine say, oh, why would I bother to go to anything? It's just a bunch of researchers talking about stuff I can't use. That maybe without the cynical tone, they might be right. Like,
Yeah.
there's a lot of research
It's
that's just not.
it's not that research is out to find an answer to the same question you faced on Tuesday when you were teaching your seventh graders.
Exactly.
You have so many steps to go between that research and your question, and
Yeah.
it could be helpful. But honestly, it's like, because of the way that research is, it's like this one little piece. It's
Yeah.
not a big question answering all. Like, I was once asked, is there one research article I could read? Like,
About
no,
what?
I described it as like there's oceans, there's
About what?
currents in the ocean of
Yeah.
research. And so there's so much more out there. There isn't one. And so if you want big overview things, then what you do have to do is look at those overview pieces, the textbooks that are seeking to
Textbooks.
survey all
Yeah.
of research. And that's a great
Yeah.
way to get a framework for it. If you're wanting to read a single study, don't have that expectation that it's going to answer all of my questions, because that's not even what it's setting out to do.
No, it's kind of like saying like which link in a chain should I use for my chain? And it's like it's not the nature of the link to be the chain. It's one research article is just meant to be, like you said, one moment in a long discussion. That's how it works. So yeah, so I think textbooks that are made to be readable for maybe college students, those are often the ones. Some of them are more readable than others.
Yeah.
But even
That
those,
was another
yeah,
thing I was going to say, that like everything else that's a human endeavor, some research is written poorly, and it's
sure,
hard, or it's
sure,
obscure, or wordy. It's, it's not very clearly written. That's totally possible. Beyond the issue of having very specialized vocabulary in there, there's
yeah,
also writing style that varies because people vary. And so some will be harder to read just because of that.
yeah,
So there's nothing wrong with you if you find something hard to read. It could be really,
yeah,
everybody kind of finds this author hard to read.
right. If you are looking for actual research, though, you might still start with those sorts of textbooks that summarize. I think Bill Van
Yeah,
Patten has a book called Key Terms in Second Language Acquisition.
yeah,
Um, he's got three
yeah.
books through Actual that I don't know if they do much with citations. I was going to say
Some.
that there's some.
And he
Yeah,
suggests some more at the end of each chapter, like you
there
could
you go.
read this further if you want
Yeah,
more. Patsy Lightbound and Nina Spada's book, How Languages Are Learned, has been, now it's in its, I think it's fifth edition, and
yeah,
they keep updating. I think it's a great place to start too,
yeah,
partly
yeah,
because they do very intentionally cite people and different kinds of studies. They're really trying to be very comprehensive in their overview. And you can go and read those specifics as you have a specific interest,
yeah,
build off of what they did there.
yeah.
Oh, yeah,
I think we did it. I think we covered it.
I think
Anything
so.
else?
Oh, yeah, we have less than 1 minute on the
We have less than a
recording. So
minute on the
that
recording.
those were the big things I was hoping to get at. So, valuable, but be realistic, be a little bit of a critical thinker about yourself, about
Yeah.
what you're trying to read. And
Yeah,
yeah,
and the metaphor would be like, what should should I go watch mechanics do their technical work on my car so that I can drive? And the answer is kind of not really. It's a little, maybe a little, but if you're interested, check it out. That's what I would say. If you're
yeah,
interested, check it out. Maybe start with a kind of text and not a research article.
yeah, agreed.
Okay, I've been Reed Riggs.
I'm Diane Neubauer.
Okay, thanks for listening.
Mhm.